The ship groaned as it plummeted through the atmosphere, flames licking the edges of its hull, alarms blared, and Ethan's hands shook on the controls. They weren't supposed to end up here. Not on this planet. They had been searching for a safe haven, a new world for humanity to settle after the collapse of Earth. Instead, they had crash-landed on an unknown, hostile alien planet. Now, survival was his only mission. "Brace yourself!" Ethan shouted into the comms, though no one was likely left to hear him. His ship jolted violently as it descended. He could feel the heat as the planet's gravity pulled them faster and faster toward the ground. The impact was inevitable. When the crash came, it hit like a sledgehammer. The metal screamed as the ship's body buckled under the force, sending Ethan flying forward. His vision blacked out for a moment. When he came to, everything was still. The cockpit was filled with the smell of burning wires and the sound of sparking electronics. His body ached, but he was alive. Somehow, he unstrapped himself, groaning in pain as he forced his body to move. The cockpit was a mangled wreck. Outside, he could see the strange landscape of the planet through the shattered window. Massive, twisted trees reached toward a dark, cloud-filled sky. Strange glowing vines wrapped around their trunks, illuminating the eerie terrain in an unnatural light. Ethan stumbled out of the ship, coughing as smoke billowed from the wreckage. His eyes squinted against the dim light of the alien world. The ground was soft, spongy beneath his boots, and every step sent a ripple through the strange surface. This place felt alive. His mind raced. He had to find shelter, maybe even survivors. He grabbed a few supplies from the wreckage, a med kit, his sidearm, and a small oxygen canister, and set off into the unknown. The eerie silence was unsettling, and the only sounds were his own footsteps and the occasional crackle of the wrecked ship behind him. As he moved deeper into the forest, something felt off. He couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement. Ethan froze, hand on his weapon. His heart pounded in his chest as he scanned the shadows between the trees. Something was watching him. He slowly backed up, his senses heightened, and then he saw her. An alien woman stepped out from the shadows, her skin a glowing, soft blue that shimmered in the dim light. Her long, dark hair flowed down her back, and her eyes, large, bright, and filled with curiosity, locked onto him. She was unlike anything he had seen before, her features human-like but clearly not of this world. She took a cautious step toward him, her gaze never leaving his. Ethan's hand hovered over his sidearm, but he didn't pull it out. Something about her wasn't threatening. If anything, she looked curious, almost as if she were wondering why he was here. "Who are you?" Ethan asked, his voice hoarse from the smoke and fear. He wasn't sure if she'd understand him, but he had to try. The alien woman tilted her head, studying him intently. To his surprise, she spoke. Her voice was soft but clear. "You? Human?" Ethan blinked in shock. She spoke his language, albeit broken. "Yes, I'm human. We crashed here. Our ship." She cut him off, her eyes narrowing. "Others. Hunters. They will come." Ethan's stomach twisted. Hunters? Was she talking about the rest of the crew? Or something worse? Hunters? "Who are they?" he asked, stepping forward. She didn't answer, only motioned for him to follow. "No time. Come. Now." Despite the warning bells ringing in his mind, Ethan felt a strange sense of trust toward her. Maybe it was the desperation of his situation or the calm urgency in her eyes, but he found himself following her deeper into the alien forest. The terrain grew more treacherous, with massive roots rising from the ground like thick cables, and the eerie glow of the vines casting strange shadows around them. Every step felt like venturing further into an unknown abyss. Ethan's breath came in shallow bursts. He didn't know if this woman was leading him to safety or into a trap, but right now, she was his only hope. Suddenly, she stopped. "Here," she whispered, pushing aside a thick curtain of vines. Behind it was an entrance to a cave, hidden from view by the overgrowth. The air was cool inside, and the walls glowed with a faint bioluminescence. It was surprisingly peaceful, but Ethan didn't have time to take it all in. "They will not find us here," the woman said, watching him closely. Ethan leaned against the cave wall, his body shaking from adrenaline. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low. She hesitated before answering. "I am Jane." Ethan nodded, trying to make sense of everything. "Jane, why did you help me?" Jane's glowing eyes softened. "Because you are not like them." Ethan frowned. "Like who?" Her gaze darkened. "The hunters. They come for everything." Ethan's mind raced. Whoever these hunters were, they sounded dangerous. And if they were after him, he wasn't safe no matter how hidden this cave was. "Why haven't they found you?" he asked. Jane looked at him, her expression unreadable. "They do not know I am here. I hide from them." Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He had crash-landed on a hostile alien planet, and now he was hiding in a cave with an alien woman who seemed to be running from something far worse. He didn't know if he could trust her, but he had no other choice. "You should rest," Jane said, her voice softening. "You will need strength for what is coming." Ethan swallowed hard. What exactly is coming? Jane met his gaze, her eyes filled with a quiet intensity. War. Ethan could hardly rest. Every time he closed his eyes, his mind raced back to the crash, to the alien world, and to Jane. Her cryptic warnings about hunters kept replaying in his head. War was coming, she had said. But what kind of war? Who were these hunters? And why were they after him or her? He sat up, the cool air of the cave chilling his skin. Jane stood at the entrance, her tall frame silhouetted by the faint light outside. She was eerily still, watching the jungle with an intensity that unnerved him. Even though they had only known each other for a few hours, he could sense she had lived through horrors he couldn't even imagine. "Jane," Ethan called softly, breaking the silence. She turned her head slightly to acknowledge him but didn't move from her spot. "You never explained who the hunters are." "They come from above," she said, still staring into the darkness beyond the cave. "Not like you, but they take everything." Ethan frowned, walking over to her. "Not like me. They're not human." She shook her head, her long dark hair catching the faint light. "They are not from your world. They are from many worlds. They hunt those who try to escape them." His mind raced, piecing together what little he knew. "Are they some kind of empire? Pirates?" Jane looked at him then, her glowing blue eyes filled with something he recognized. Fear. "They are worse than any empire. They do not conquer. They do not build. They destroy." Ethan's blood ran cold. If what she said was true, they weren't just dealing with raiders or scavengers. These hunters were something far more dangerous. And if they were coming for him, or for her, then he needed to be ready. "We need to figure out how to stop them," Ethan said, his voice filled with determination. He wasn't a soldier anymore, but the instincts never left. He knew how to fight, and he wasn't going to let these hunters take them without putting up a fight. Jane's eyes softened. "You cannot stop them alone. I've seen what they do. They take the strong. They take the weak. No one is safe." Ethan ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small cave. "Then what do we do? Wait here and hope they don't find us?" Jane turned back to the jungle, her expression unreadable. "There is a place, far from here, an old ship, buried deep in the forest. It was from before, when my people tried to fight them." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "A ship? You're saying there's a way off this planet?" She nodded slowly. "It is old, but it still has power. If you can reach it, you might leave." Ethan felt a surge of hope. A way off the planet, a chance to escape before the hunters closed in. But then he noticed the way Jane's voice had faltered, the way she looked down at the ground when she spoke of the ship. "You're not planning to come with me, are you?" Ethan asked, his voice quieter now. Jane didn't answer at first. Her glowing eyes dimmed as she took a deep breath. "This is my home. I cannot leave it. If I go, they will find me. I've spent my life hiding." Ethan felt a pang of guilt and something else, something deeper. "Jane, if they find you, they'll kill you. You can't just stay here and hope they never come." She finally turned to face him, her gaze steady. "I have survived this long. I will survive again." He didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to grab her, make her see reason, tell her that she didn't have to do this alone. But another part of him understood. This was her world, her fight, and maybe she didn't want to run from it. A sudden noise cut through the silence, a low, mechanical hum that seemed to echo through the jungle. Jane stiffened, her eyes widening. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He recognized that sound. It was the sound of engines. "They are coming," Jane whispered. Stepping back into the cave, Ethan rushed to the entrance, peering out into the dark jungle. His stomach twisted when he saw the faint lights cutting through the trees in the distance. They weren't natural lights, they were machines. And they were moving fast. "Get inside," Ethan said, grabbing her arm. She didn't resist, allowing him to pull her back into the shadows of the cave. The hum grew louder, the lights closer. Ethan's mind raced, adrenaline flooding his system. "We can't stay here," he muttered, pacing the small space. "If they get too close, they'll find us." Jane's voice was calm, but it held an edge of urgency. "There is a passage deeper into the cave. We can go, but it will be dark. You must trust me." Ethan nodded, already feeling the walls closing in around him. "Lead the way." Jane moved quickly, guiding him deeper into the cave. The walls narrowed, and soon they were in complete darkness. The only sound, their hurried footsteps and the distant hum of the hunters' machines outside. Ethan's heart pounded as they descended further into the earth, the cool air growing heavier, more oppressive. "This way," Jane whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan followed her voice, his hand trailing along the wall to guide him. After what felt like hours, the passage opened up into a larger chamber, dimly lit by the same bioluminescent plants they had seen earlier. It was eerie, but at least they could see. Jane stopped, her breathing heavy. "We must wait here. They will not come this far." Ethan leaned against the wall, trying to steady his racing heart. "How do you know that?" She met his gaze, her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "Because I have been hiding from them my whole life." He didn't know how to respond to that. She had been living in fear of these hunters for years, and yet she had saved him without hesitation.
"Why?"
"Jane," Ethan said, his voice softer now. "Why did you help me?" She looked down, her expression unreadable. "Because you are not like the others. You do not come to destroy." Ethan felt a lump in his throat. He didn't deserve her trust, not after what humans had done to worlds like hers. But here they were, trapped together in a cave, both of them running from the same enemy. The hum of the machines grew fainter, but the danger was far from over. Ethan knew they couldn't stay here forever. They had to move, had to find the ship she had spoken of. But as he looked at Jane, standing there with that quiet strength, he realized something else. He didn't want to leave her behind. The cave was silent again, but the tension lingered in the air. Ethan sat with his back against the cool stone wall, his thoughts racing as he tried to process everything that had happened. Jane had saved him, but now they were trapped underground with only a faint hope of survival. The hunters were closing in, and every second they spent here made them more vulnerable. "We can't stay here much longer," Ethan said, breaking the silence. He stood and glanced at Jane, who remained still, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Jane nodded, her face unreadable. "I know, but we must wait until they have passed. If we leave too soon, they will track us." Ethan clenched his fists, frustration gnawing at him. "How long do we wait? They're not going to give up. If they're anything like the hunters I've seen before, they'll scour every inch of this planet until they find what they're looking for." Jane didn't answer immediately. She sat in thought, her eyes shifting toward the dimly lit passage they had come from. "They will move on. They always do. If they don't sense anything nearby, it's how I've survived all these years." Ethan paced the small chamber. He knew she was right, but the idea of sitting idly while the enemy lurked nearby made him anxious. Every instinct screamed at him to move, to take action. But here, on this alien world, his usual tactics weren't enough. He was in Jane's world now, and he had to trust her judgment, even if it went against everything he'd learned. Jane stood suddenly, breaking his thoughts. "It is time. They have moved far enough. We must go now." Ethan grabbed the small pack of supplies he had scavenged from the wrecked ship and followed Jane back into the narrow passageway. The air was cool and damp, and the bioluminescent glow from the cave walls barely illuminated their path. They moved quickly, but quietly, retracing their steps through the labyrinthine tunnels. As they reached the cave's entrance, Ethan crouched low, peering out into the jungle. The dark trees and glowing vines still surrounded them, but the eerie mechanical hum had faded into the distance. The hunters had moved on. For now. Where's the ship? Ethan asked, scanning the dense forest. Is it far? Jane gestured toward the far edge of the jungle, where the trees grew taller and denser, their massive roots tangling together like a giant web. It is deep within the forest, hidden beneath the roots of the great trees. Ethan nodded. All right. Lead the way. Jane moved swiftly, her steps sure and precise, even in the dark. Ethan followed close behind, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. The jungle was alive with strange sounds, creatures scurrying through the underbrush, the rustling of the glowing vines overhead, and the occasional distant rumble of thunder from the purple-lit sky. Everything about this place felt both beautiful and dangerous. After what felt like hours of navigating the dense jungle, Jane finally stopped. Before them stood a towering tree, its massive roots spiraling upward like ancient pillars. The air around the tree hummed with a faint energy, and Ethan could feel the power radiating from it. Jane knelt by the base of the tree, brushing aside the glowing vines to reveal a hidden hatch, half buried beneath the earth. The metal was old and rusted, but it still held the faint markings of an ancient alien script. This is it, Jane said quietly. The ship. Ethan stared at the hatch, his heart pounding. This was their way out. If the ship still worked, they could escape before the hunters found them. But there was no guarantee it would fly after all these years. And even if it did, there was no telling what condition it was in. Jane placed her hand on the hatch, her fingers tracing the alien symbols. It is old, but it was built by my ancestors. It is strong. It will fly. Ethan knelt beside her, helping her pry open the hatch. The metal groaned as it shifted, revealing a dark passage leading down into the earth. A faint light flickered from below, casting eerie shadows on the walls. They climbed down into the ship, the narrow corridor opening into a larger chamber. The walls were lined with strange technology, glowing consoles and alien machinery that hummed with a faint energy. It was like stepping into another world, a world that had been forgotten for centuries. This is incredible, Ethan muttered, running his hand along the smooth surface of the control panel. How long has this been here? Generations, Jane replied, her voice soft. My people once used it to fight the hunters, but we lost, and the ship was hidden, waiting for the day when it would be needed again. Ethan nodded, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how to bring the ship back to life. He was no pilot, but he had basic knowledge of spacecraft. He just needed to figure out how to interface with this alien technology. Jane moved to one of the control consoles, her hands moving gracefully over the controls. The ship hummed louder, and lights began to flicker on, illuminating the chamber in a soft, blue glow. Ethan's heart pounded with excitement. You know how to fly this thing? Jane nodded, her eyes focused on the console. I was taught. My people knew this day would come. As the ship powered up, Ethan glanced toward the entrance, the uneasy feeling from earlier creeping back. The hunters were still out there, and now that the ship was active, it would only be a matter of time before they picked up the energy signature. We need to move fast, he said, his voice tense. If the hunters detect this ship, they'll be on us in minutes. Jane's fingers moved swiftly across the console, and the ship's systems came to life. The hum of the engines grew louder, and the floor beneath them vibrated as the ship began to power up. We will leave soon, Jane said, her voice calm. But first, I must set the course. Ethan watched her work, his mind racing. This was it, their only chance to escape. But as he looked at Jane, focused and determined, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than she was letting on. Jane, he said softly, why haven't you left before? Why wait until now? Jane paused for a moment, her fingers hovering over the controls. She didn't look at him, but her voice was quiet when she spoke. Because I could not leave my people. They are gone now. But this planet, it is all I have left. Ethan's chest tightened. He understood her pain. Earth had been his home, and now it was gone, just like Jane's people. They were both survivors, clinging to the last remnants of their worlds. "You don't have to stay here," Ethan said, stepping closer to her. "You don't have to fight this alone." Jane finally looked up at him, her eyes filled with a quiet sorrow. "But this is my home. If I leave, what will I have left?" Ethan didn't have an answer. All he knew was that he didn't want to leave her behind, not after everything they had been through. But he couldn't force her to come with him. The choice was hers. "Then let's get this ship ready," he said quietly, turning back to the console. "We'll figure out the rest later." Jane nodded, her eyes lingering on him for a moment longer before she returned to the controls. The ship hummed louder, the engines fully powering up. But just as Ethan began to feel hope, the familiar, dreaded hum of the hunters' machines echoed from the jungle. "They've found us," Ethan muttered, his hand instinctively reaching for his sidearm. Jane's eyes widened. "We must leave now." Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He moved to the entrance of the ship, peering out into the dark jungle. The hunters' lights were closer now, cutting through the trees like searchlights. They were moving fast, and there was no time to lose. "We have to fight them off until the ship's ready," Ethan said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Jane nodded, her face resolute. "We fight together." They stood side by side at the entrance of the ship, weapons in hand. As the hunters closed in, the jungle around the hidden ship crackled with tension as the hunters' lights drew nearer. Ethan could feel his pulse quicken, the familiar rush of adrenaline flooding his system. Every instinct from his time in the military screamed at him to take cover, to hide. But there was no more running. They had to hold their ground here. Jane stood beside him, her alien weapon in hand, her glowing blue skin radiating a faint light in the eerie darkness. She was calm, her eyes fixed on the approaching danger. Ethan glanced at her, and despite the overwhelming odds, her presence gave him strength. "We don't have long," Ethan muttered, keeping his voice low. "Once they realize we're here, they'll attack fast. We need to hold them off until the ship is ready to fly." Jane nodded, her grip tightening on her weapon. "I will fight. My people were once warriors. I remember what I was taught." Ethan felt a pang of admiration for her. Jane had been hiding from the hunters for so long, but now she was ready to face them head on. And so was he. The sound of engines grew louder, and the hunters' searchlights cut through the dense jungle, sweeping across the trees and the ground. Shadows danced as the light passed over the hidden ship. They were getting closer. Too close. Ethan checked his sidearm, making sure it was fully charged. It wasn't much against the kind of technology the hunters had, but it was better than nothing. Beside him, Jane prepared her weapon, her eyes narrowing as the lights closed in on their position. Then, through the thick trees, the first of the hunter drones appeared. It was sleek and menacing, hovering just above the ground, its searchlight sweeping the area. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He had seen similar drones during his time in the military, but these were far more advanced, their armor reflecting the strange energy of this alien world. The drone stopped, its searchlight focusing on the hidden ship. "They've found us," Ethan whispered. Jane didn't hesitate. She raised her weapon and fired a pulse of energy at the drone. The shot hit the drone square in its center, causing it to sputter and drop to the ground with a heavy thud. Sparks flew from its damaged frame. But it was too late. The rest of the hunters would know they were here now. "We need to fall back," Ethan said, grabbing Jane's arm. "We can't take them all on out here. We'll fight them off from inside the ship." Jane nodded, and the two of them retreated into the ship's entrance. The engines hummed louder, and Ethan could feel the power of the ancient vessel building. It was almost ready. Almost. More drones appeared, their lights cutting through the darkness, followed by larger hunter ships. The sleek, black vessels hovered above the treetops, their cannons swiveling as they prepared to fire. Ethan crouched behind the cover of the ship's doorway, aiming his sidearm at one of the drones. He fired, hitting its sensor, causing it to spiral out of control and crash into the ground. But more were coming, too many to fight off with just the two of them. "They're closing in," Ethan shouted over the roar of the approaching ships. "We need to hold them off for a little longer." Jane fired again, her aim precise as she took down another drone. But the larger hunter ships were getting into position, Ethan could see their cannons powering up, preparing to obliterate the ship before it could take off. "Jane," Ethan shouted, his voice filled with urgency. "How much longer?" Jane glanced at the control panel inside the ship, her expression tight with focus. "The ship is almost ready, but we need more time." Ethan gritted his teeth, his mind racing. Time was the one thing they didn't have. If the hunters fired their cannons now, it would all be over. Just as the first hunter ship aimed its cannon at the ancient vessel, Ethan made a split-second decision. He bolted from the ship's entrance, sprinting toward the tree line where the hunter drones and ships hovered. His heart pounded in his chest, and every muscle screamed at him to stop. But he kept going. "Ethan." "No," Jane's voice echoed behind him. But he didn't slow down. He had to create a distraction. If the hunters focused on him, it might buy them enough time to get the ship off the ground. It was a gamble. But it was the only chance they had. Ethan fired at the nearest drone. Drawing its attention, the hunter ship shifted its focus toward him, its cannon charging up as it prepared to fire. He dodged behind a thick tree trunk, narrowly avoiding the blast as the cannon fired, scorching the ground where he had just stood. His lungs burned as he kept moving, firing at anything that moved, hoping to keep the hunters occupied long enough. He could feel the heat of their energy blasts behind him, the sound of their cannons shaking the ground. "Come on!" he shouted, daring them to focus on him. "Over here!" The hunter ships turned, their weapons trained on him. Ethan's heart pounded. He was running out of options. Then, just as he thought the end was near, a deafening roar filled the air. The ground trembled beneath his feet as the ancient ship's engines roared to life. Jane had done it. The hunters hesitated, their attention shifting back to the ship. It was rising from the ground, its ancient power surging through the air as it lifted off. "Ethan, get to the ship." Jane's voice echoed through the jungle. Filled with urgency, Ethan sprinted toward the ship, his legs burning with exhaustion. The hunter ships fired, but their blasts missed as the ship ascended higher into the air. He reached the entrance just as the ship began to lift off, grabbing the edge and pulling himself inside. Jane was at the controls, her face illuminated by the soft blue glow of the ship's interior. "Let's get out of here," Ethan gasped, collapsing into one of the seats. Jane didn't hesitate. The ship surged forward, leaving the hunters behind as it soared through the dense jungle and into the sky. The hum of the engines was deafening, and the view outside was a blur of trees and clouds. As they broke through the atmosphere and into the dark expanse of space, Ethan let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. They had made it. Somehow, against all odds, they had survived. Jane turned to him, her glowing eyes softening. "You risked your life for me," Ethan chuckled, though it was more out of relief than humor. "Couldn't let them take you. Or the ship. Besides, I wasn't about to leave you behind." Jane smiled, a real smile that made her glow even brighter. For the first time since they had met, Ethan felt something more than just the adrenaline of survival. He felt a connection, a bond that went beyond the danger they had faced together. "You are different, Ethan," Jane said softly. "You are not like the others." Ethan leaned back in his seat, the stars stretching out before them as they sped away from the planet. "I could say the same about you." As they flew through the vast expanse of space, leaving the hunters and the alien world behind, Ethan couldn't help but wonder what came next. They were free, but their journey was far from over. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't alone.